The coffee mug shattered against the break room floor, spraying hot liquid across the tile. Gavin Cross had Clara Miller backed against the counter, his arm blocking her escape route, body leaning uncomfortably close to her trembling form. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on me with a desperate plea I had seen too many times on too many faces. Gavin asked what I wanted without turning his head, his voice dripping with irritation at the interruption. I placed myself directly between them, forcing him back a step. I told him that I needed him to stop cornering women in this office immediately. The silence felt electric. Clara seized her chance to slip away, clutching her folder against her chest like a shield. Gavin mockingly asked what I was talking about, his signature smirk appearing, the one that said he knew exactly what game he was playing. I stepped closer. I told him that I had watched him trapping women in corners for months, whispering things that made their skin crawl, and touching them when they had made it clear they did not want it. His eyes narrowed, that smirk momentarily faltering. He demanded to know whom I believed I was addressing. I replied that I was well aware of his identity and asked if he knew whom he was confronting. Gavin glanced around the break room, reassuring himself that no one else was watching. He told me that he did not know what my problem was. I quietly said the word Maui, maintaining direct eye contact. The color drained from his face. I continued, telling him that I knew about Maui, about what happened on the resort balcony with Diana Powell, about the elevator incident with Fiona Mercer, and about how he had followed Chloe Jenkins to her room. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. He claimed I was bluffing. I told him that the board meeting was scheduled to start in 20 minutes and that I had requested to speak. I asked if he wanted to walk there together. He bolted from the break room. My name is Julian Vance, and I am a senior compliance analyst. I am 48 years old, and I am not someone who stands out in a crowd. I am of average height, with brown hair that I keep neatly trimmed, and the kind of face people think they have seen before but cannot quite place. This invisibility had become my greatest asset. My job involves reviewing internal processes, looking for inconsistencies, gathering data, and identifying patterns. I was good at my job precisely because I noticed the things that others preferred to ignore. 11 months ago, I joined Apex Logistics fresh from a similar position at a smaller firm. During my first week, I watched Gavin isolate Grace Evans, a marketing coordinator, in the copy room. His body language, the way he leaned in, and the unmistakable discomfort in her posture immediately triggered alarm bells in my mind. My manager, Brooke Kelly, whispered a warning when she caught me watching. We were sharing lunch in the courtyard. She told me that he was the vice president's nephew and was considered untouchable. She warned me to stay silent for the sake of my own career. Her warning was not unique. Over the next few weeks, I heard variations of the same advice from several long-term employees. They told me that was just how things were, that nothing could be done, and that it was best to keep my head down. What these well-meaning colleagues did not realize was that keeping my head down was no longer in my nature. 5 years earlier, at my previous job with Nexus Enterprises, I had experienced a similar situation. I had reported a senior executive's misconduct through the proper channels, trusting the system to work. Instead, I ended up being the one pushed out of the company, while the executive received a promotion. That betrayal taught me that official processes often protect predators rather than their victims. So, I began watching Gavin with methodical attention. His pattern emerged clearly over the months. He carefully calculated the timing of his advances, ensuring they were just private enough to avoid witnesses, but not so isolated as to seem deliberate. He chose vulnerable targets, such as new hires who had not yet established workplace allies, contract workers who feared for their job security, and single mothers who could not risk unemployment. Most revealing was how he leveraged the company's unspoken politics. His uncle, Gerald Cross, the vice president of operations, had built a protective fortress around Gavin through the strategic hiring and promotion of loyalists. Human resources complaints mysteriously disappeared from the files. Women who requested transfers were labeled difficult. Those who pushed too hard found themselves receiving negative performance reviews. I made myself invisible, blending into the background of meetings, lingering in hallways, and becoming the forgettable face that people spoke freely around. I built relationships with administrative assistants, maintenance staff, and security personnel, the eyes and ears of the organization who see everything while remaining unseen themselves. The company retreat to Maui 6 months ago provided my first real opening. 3 women had separate incidents with Gavin during that trip. I befriended the resort staff who had witnessed his behavior, and they shared details with me. I also began connecting with former employees who had left the company because of Gavin. I arranged coffee meetings and lunch conversations, gradually building a network of women who shared similar experiences. We were not gossiping, we were gathering truth, establishing pattern recognition. For months, I gathered information methodically, not for a standard legal case, but to assemble a collective truth that would be too consistent to dismiss. Then Clara Miller arrived. She is 24 years old, in her first corporate job, and supporting her younger siblings while their mother battles cancer. I recognized Gavin's predatory interest during her introduction meeting. The way he lingered, offering to show her around, and the way his eyes tracked her movements in the hallways made his intentions obvious. I had warned her subtly, but her vulnerability made her the ideal target. When I walked into the break room today and saw her trapped against the counter, something inside me finally snapped. I knew that the time for quiet observation had ended, and the time for action had begun. I had to put an end to this cycle, no matter the personal cost to my career. After Gavin fled the break room, I helped Clara collect her thoughts and pick up the pieces of the shattered coffee mug. She was trembling, her voice barely audible as she thanked me. She whispered that nobody had ever stood up for her before, and that everyone else usually just looked away. I squeezed her hand gently and promised her that things would be different from now on. I returned to my desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and determination. I had accelerated my timeline, forcing my hand before I was fully prepared, but I knew it was the right decision. A few minutes later, the company network pinged with a notification announcing an emergency board meeting scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I had not actually requested to speak at the meeting, as that had been a bluff to rattle Gavin, but he had clearly believed me capable of it and had panicked. My phone began buzzing with text messages from my manager, Brooke Kelly. She asked what I had done, warning me that Gerald Cross was furious and that Gavin was claiming I had threatened him. I did not respond to her messages. Instead, I sent out a pre-prepared message to my secured network of 24 current and former employees who had shared their experiences with me over the last 11 months. I told them that the moment had arrived and that we needed to assemble at the boardroom at 3 o'clock. By 2:40, my office phone rang. The board assistant's voice was clipped and formal as she requested my presence in the boardroom immediately. I told her I would be there. I spent the next 20 minutes reviewing my notes, not to prepare what I would say, but to reassure myself of the facts. I locked my computer, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the elevator. The boardroom was located on the top floor, featuring large windows that overlooked the city skyline. 15 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces expressing a combination of concern and annoyance. Gerald Cross sat at the head of the table, his resemblance to Gavin unmistakable in their shared jawline and cold, calculating eyes. Gerald began by addressing me, claiming that his nephew had reported me for creating a hostile work environment, spreading malicious rumors, and making threats. He asserted that such behavior violated numerous company policies and would lead to immediate termination. My heart sank, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had anticipated this exact scenario. They were going to try to silence me and fire me before I could present any evidence, possibly even pursuing legal action for defamation. Gerald continued his lecture, but I interrupted him, keeping my voice steadier than I felt. I told him that he should know I was not alone in this matter. Confusion flickered across his face. Before he could respond, the boardroom door opened. Evelyn Thorne, the chief financial officer and the only woman in senior leadership, entered the room first. She was followed by Brooke Kelly. Behind them came Clara Miller, still visibly shaken but standing tall. Then more faces appeared in the doorway. Fiona Mercer from accounting, Diana Powell from graphic design, and Chloe Jenkins from client relations. 5 current employees stood together in silent solidarity. Behind them, 12 more women filed into the room. These were former employees who had coordinated their schedules and traveled from various locations to attend this meeting. Finally, 2 women representing Dalton Solutions, one of our largest clients, entered the room. The board members' expressions transformed from annoyance to utter shock as more and more women filed in, lining the walls of the room until there was no space left. Gerald demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, half rising from his chair. I stood up to face him directly. I told him that they wanted to discuss hostile work environments, and that we all had stories to tell and were prepared to share them here today, or publicly if necessary. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted instantly. Gerald's expression hardened into a glare, but Evelyn Thorne spoke up before he could speak. Her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of authority, as she suggested that the board should listen to what these women had to say before making any decisions. The general counsel, Quincy Lawson, protested, adjusting his tie nervously. He argued that the proceedings were highly irregular and that they could not allow employees to disrupt a board meeting with unproven accusations. Evelyn interrupted him, asking what would be sufficient. She asked if having enough women to fill the entire room was not enough, or if they preferred to wait for potential legal liability that could permanently damage the company's reputation. She pointed out that there were clear violations of every ethics policy the company claimed to uphold. A tense silence followed her words. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. Wallace Briggs, the oldest board member, leaned forward, his weathered face grave. He stated that he moved to hear what the women had to say, noting that if there was truth in these claims, they needed to address it immediately. Gerald tried to object, but the momentum had shifted, and the board members were no longer willing to ignore the crowd standing before them. For the next hour, the boardroom became a place of raw and painful truths as one woman after another stepped forward to speak. There were no dramatic recordings or secret documents presented. At first, just consistent testimonies that painted an undeniable pattern of behavior. Diana Powell described the Maui incident, explaining how Gavin had cornered her on the resort balcony during the company retreat. She recalled how he told her that her promotion was being considered and that he had significant influence with his uncle, before putting his hand on her lower back and suggesting they go to his room. Fiona Mercer spoke next, describing how Gavin had pressed against her in the elevator when they were alone. When she objected, he had laughed and told her she should learn to take a compliment, and the very next day, her primary project was reassigned to another analyst. Former employees shared similar stories spanning the last 5 years. A clear pattern emerged of isolation, proposition, and retaliation. Women who rejected Gavin's advances found themselves receiving poor performance reviews, losing opportunities, or suddenly being told they did not fit the company culture. Throughout the testimonies, I watched the board members' faces. Some showed genuine shock, others displayed growing anger, while a few, including Gerald Cross, maintained carefully neutral expressions. Gerald tried to interject several times, claiming that these were serious allegations without physical proof. However, Chloe Jenkins cut him off, stating that she was not finished. She explained that after the Maui retreat, she had reported the incident to Human Resources, only to be placed on a performance improvement plan for communication issues 2 weeks later. The HR report she filed had mysteriously vanished from the company database. Brooke Kelly stepped forward next, her testimony carrying significant weight as a manager. She admitted that she had witnessed Gavin's behavior for months and felt ashamed that she had advised women to keep quiet for their own protection. She stated that she had been complicit in the culture of silence and was there today because she refused to participate in it any longer. Clara Miller spoke last, her voice trembling but determined. She explained that she had only been at the company for 5 weeks and had already been cornered twice. She noted that she needed the job to support her family while her mother fought cancer, a detail Gavin knew and had used to threaten her, suggesting that she should not do anything to jeopardize her position. The room fell silent when Clara finished speaking. 24 women stood as a testament to a systemic failure. Quincy Lawson cleared his throat and noted that while the accounts were concerning, they remained allegations without physical evidence. I interjected, telling him that if he mentioned a lack of evidence one more time, I would have to wonder why he was so invested in dismissing the consistent testimonies of nearly 30 women. I explained the legal reality to the board, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the established Farragher-Ellerth affirmative defense doctrine. A company is held liable for supervisor harassment unless it can prove it exercised reasonable care to prevent and correct the behavior. By proving that Gerald Cross systematically destroyed human resources records and retaliated against claimants, the company had completely forfeited any legal defense. This exposed Apex Logistics to millions of dollars in punitive damages in federal court. I placed a folder on the table stating it contained the names and contact details of every victim, and that we were prepared to take this information public if the board did not act immediately. Gerald angrily accused me of extortion. Evelyn Thorne countered, stating it was accountability. She turned to the board and moved that they immediately suspend Gavin Cross pending a full investigation, hire an independent firm to conduct the inquiry, and establish a committee to review and strengthen the company's harassment policies. Wallace Briggs seconded the motion immediately. Gerald and his ally Harvey Fletcher protested, but Evelyn coolly reminded them of the board's fiduciary responsibility to protect the company from massive legal exposure and a public relations disaster. A vote was called, and the motion passed 12-3, with only Gerald and his two closest allies voting against it. Evelyn turned to me and requested that our group submit policy recommendations by the end of the week, noting that she would be heading the committee personally. As we filed out of the room, Brooke Kelly caught my arm and asked how I had managed to organize this. I replied simply that I had listened to them, and I had believed them when no one else would. The battle had begun, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead of us. Every person in the boardroom seemed to feel the weight of what had just transpired. Even the most stoic board members had shifted uncomfortably in their seats during the testimonies. To witness such a unified front was rare in a corporate environment where isolation is the standard tool of intimidation. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the wall of silence had finally cracked. The board members were now forced to look at the patterns of behavior they had ignored for years. I knew that Gerald Cross would try to find a way to dismantle our coalition, but with the support of Evelyn Thorne and Wallace Briggs, we had established a beachhead. The legal implications I had cited were not empty threats. They were the precise instruments of corporate accountability. By invoking the Farragher-Ellerth doctrine, I had shown them that their ignorance was no longer a shield. We had documented everything, and the board now knew that any attempt to sweep this under the rug would result in a public relations disaster. I walked back to my desk, knowing that the next few days would be critical. We had to prepare our policy recommendations, keep the victims unified, and ensure that the independent investigators had access to every document and witness. The fight was far from over, but for the first time we had a voice. The next 3 days passed in a blur of meetings, investigations, and high tension. Gavin Cross was noticeably absent, having been escorted from the building immediately after the board vote. Gerald remained in his office with the door closed, emerging only for essential meetings, his authority severely diminished. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, instructing me to meet in the parking garage on level 3 immediately. I hesitated and showed the message to Brooke Kelly. She advised me not to go alone. I agreed, sending a quick message to Evelyn Thorne and company security before heading down. The parking garage was dimly lit as I stepped off the elevator. Evelyn and Sylvia Cole, the head of security, flanked me. Gavin was standing beside his luxury car, looking disheveled and angry. He yelled that I had ruined everything and that his uncle could no longer protect him. I replied calmly that he had ruined himself and that I had simply ensured the truth was heard. He stepped toward me, but Sylvia Cole intervened. Evelyn informed him that the independent investigation was starting the next morning and advised him to leave the premises immediately, as his access privileges had been revoked. Gavin glared at us, muttering that this was not over before driving away. The next morning, news reports began to surface online. A major executive had been suspended following harassment allegations, and Gerald Cross had officially resigned as Vice President of Operations, effective immediately. Brooke Kelly was surprised by the sudden resignation, noting that Gerald was not a man to admit defeat so easily. She suspected that something else was going on, and she was right. Later that day, Evelyn Thorne called me into her office. She slid a tablet across her desk, showing me an email Gerald had sent to the board minutes before resigning. He wrote that in light of the information I possessed regarding Maui, he believed his continued leadership would damage the company. I was confused, explaining to Evelyn that I had only gathered information about Gavin's actions in Maui, not Gerald's. Evelyn noted that Gerald clearly believed otherwise and was willing to resign to prevent something from being exposed. The investigation had just become far more complicated. Shortly after leaving her office, I received a notification on a secured messaging app. It was from a resort staff member in Maui, whom I had befriended. He sent a brief message explaining that a video had been deleted from their security archives the previous day, but he had made a copy. He attached the video file. My hands trembled as I found an empty conference room to watch it. The footage, timestamped at 1:45 in the morning during the retreat, showed a hotel corridor. Gavin appeared, supporting an intoxicated woman who was not an employee. I recognized her as Iris Dalton, the wife of Hugo Dalton, the chief executive officer of Dalton Solutions, our largest client account, worth $40 million annually. Moments later, Gerald Cross appeared, looking agitated. They seemed to argue before Gerald grabbed the woman's other arm, and together they dragged her toward the elevator. The video ended there. My phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number, warning me to be careful, as not all monsters die when exposed to light. I took a screenshot of the threat and forwarded it to Evelyn. The atmosphere in the office was thick with suspicion. On Friday morning, I met with Evelyn and Sylvia Cole. Sylvia revealed that she had contacted Iris Dalton. Initially, Iris denied everything, but when the video was mentioned, she became highly distressed. An hour later, Hugo Dalton called the company, furiously demanding that we stop contacting his wife and threatening to terminate their $40 million contract. Sylvia explained that someone had clearly pressured the Daltons to keep quiet. Furthermore, Evelyn added that the bank had notified her of an unauthorized attempt to access confidential financial records using her credentials. It was clear that Gerald and Gavin were desperately trying to destroy evidence of financial irregularities related to the Maui retreat. The stakes had risen far beyond workplace harassment, and we were now dealing with a potential criminal cover-up that threatened the entire company. As I sat in the conference room reviewing the video, the gravity of the situation became clear. The footage was not just evidence of a moral failing. It was the key to understanding a much larger corporate conspiracy. Gerald and Gavin had not just harassed employees, they had targeted the spouses of major clients, likely using company funds to facilitate and cover up these actions. The sudden resignation of Gerald Cross was a desperate attempt to protect himself from criminal prosecution. By resigning, he hoped to limit the scope of the internal investigation and prevent the disclosure of the Maui video. But he had underestimated the reach of our network. The resort staff member who sent me the video had done so at great personal risk, driven by a desire for justice. I knew that we had to act quickly to secure the evidence. I worked with Sylvia Cole to establish a secure backup of the video and the threatening text messages. We also initiated a detailed audit of all financial transactions approved by Gerald Cross over the past 3 years. I knew that the paper trail would lead us to the truth. The threat of losing the Dalton Solutions contract was significant, but we could not allow financial concerns to override our ethical and legal obligations. The truth had to be exposed, regardless of the consequences for the company's bottom line. We were no longer just fighting for a safe workplace. We were fighting to expose a criminal network that had operated with impunity for far too long. The boardroom was packed on Monday morning for the emergency session. Gerald and Gavin Cross were absent, but their presence loomed large. Wallace Briggs called the meeting to order, and Evelyn Thorne immediately presented the new findings. She displayed the Maui video, and explained the attempt to access the financial records. Quincy Lawson argued that the video was not definitive proof of a crime. Evelyn then displayed credit card statements and corporate accounts showing unusual transactions during client events over the past 3 years. All of these transactions had been approved by Gerald Cross from his discretionary budget, totaling $85,000 across 5 payments. They matched the exact dates when female clients had reported feeling unwell. Evelyn explained that these payments were made to a consultant named Trent Albright. Suddenly, the boardroom door opened, and Gavin entered, accompanied by 2 defense attorneys. Gavin looked confident again. One of his lawyers placed a folder on the table and addressed the board, claiming that I had a history of fabricating claims. He revealed that 3 years ago, I was known as Julian Markham at Vertex Industries, where I had filed harassment claims that were dismissed as meritless, resulting in my termination. I admitted that I had filed the claims, explaining that they were dismissed because the perpetrator was the chief executive officer's son, and the company had buried the evidence, just as Gerald had done here. The lawyer then claimed that 4 of the women who had accused Gavin had signed affidavits recanting their statements, alleging that I had coerced them. He named Fiona Mercer, Chloe Jenkins, Grace Evans, and Diana Powell. I remained calm, explaining that I had anticipated this response. I directed the board to page 12 of the documentation, which contained emails from Fiona Mercer detailing how she was threatened with the loss of her tuition assistance program by an associate of Gavin's. Page 17 showed text messages from Chloe Jenkins describing how her mortgage application was threatened by a bank where Gerald Cross served on the board. I then played a video recorded by Fiona Mercer in a coffee shop. In the recording, Trent Albright could be heard telling her that her professional obstacles would disappear if she signed the affidavit against me. I explained that under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 1512, this constituted witness tampering, a felony carrying a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. The discretionary budget payments of $85,000 proved that Gerald Cross had funded this criminal activity, constituting a clear breach of fiduciary duty. I then revealed that Iris Dalton had contacted me directly through a support network. She had undergone a medical evaluation after the Maui incident, and the toxicology reports confirmed the presence of a prescription sedative. She was now cooperating with the authorities in Maui. The lawyers looked stunned, and Gavin's confidence vanished. Wallace Briggs called for an immediate vote to turn all evidence over to law enforcement, which passed unanimously. The door opened, and Detective Brenda Harlow entered with uniformed officers, executing arrest warrants for Gavin Cross and Gerald Cross for witness tampering, corporate fraud, and conspiracy. They were escorted from the building in handcuffs. In the weeks that followed, the company implemented major reforms. Wallace Briggs offered me the position of Director of Compliance Strategy, which I accepted, promoting Simon to Senior Analyst. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that true revenge was not about personal destruction, but about dismantling the system that allowed predators to feel untouchable. It was about ensuring that every employee could work in an environment where their voice was heard and protected. That was the only victory that truly mattered. Standing in my new office, I looked out at the city and felt a profound sense of relief. The files on my desk were no longer records of ignored abuse, but blueprints for a new corporate culture. The new Department of Compliance Strategy would have the resources and authority to investigate every claim thoroughly and protect whistleblowers from retaliation. I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but we had established a foundation of accountability that could not be easily dismantled. Simon was already working on the first draft of our new ethics policy, his confidence visible in the way he carried himself. The women who had stood with me in the boardroom had returned to their roles, no longer forced to work in fear. The Daltons had ultimately cooperated with the authorities, and though the company lost a portion of their business, the long-term reputation of Apex Logistics was saved. We had proven that integrity was more valuable than any contract. True justice is not always swift, but when it is built on a foundation of truth and documentation, it is inevitable. The quiet voices had prevailed, and in doing so, they had changed the company forever. As Gavin and Gerald Cross were led away in handcuffs, the silence in the boardroom was absolute. The defense lawyers quietly closed their folders, realizing that no amount of spin could overcome the concrete evidence of federal witness tampering under 18 U.S.C. Section 1512. I stood there, watching them leave, and felt a deep sense of closure. This was not just a victory for the women of Apex Logistics, but also for my own past. The memories of being pushed out of Vertex Industries 5 years ago had haunted me, but now I knew that my insistence on documenting everything had saved us. I turned to Evelyn Thorne and Wallace Briggs, who formally offered me the promotion. I accepted, on the condition that Simon was promoted to senior analyst, a request they granted without hesitation. On my first day as director, Simon brought in the final draft of our new anti-harassment policy. Looking at my new team, I knew that the system had finally worked, not because it was perfect, but because we had refused to let it fail. The true power of a compliance department is not in its rules, but in its commitment to the people it protects. We had turned a toxic workplace into a haven of accountability, and that was the most brutal revenge of all.